on at least one occasion, Eisenhower was heard to say by those in the room, "God help this country when somebody sits at this desk who doesn't know as much about the military as I do."
My fellow Americans, this evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Is there a point to all this? Let's find a point. Is this real? Or is this just a ride?
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
So let's talk about Jade Helm a little bit, because it seems like there might be some parallels to what seems to be going on. Would you say that's true?
Yes, I would, in fact, because Jade Helm involves a very large assembly of equipment and military forces. The apologists for Jade Helm suggest it's nothing but National Guard standard training involving some 1,200 troops. But there are more than 1,200 military vehicles alone that have been assembled for this. We have footage coming from citizens of railroad trains with 100 cars, and there are 2 military vehicles on each of the cars. They extend as far as the eye can see. There's the largest caravan ever seen in the history of Colorado has been passing through that state. And as a former Marine Corps officer, Greg, I can assure you, you cannot assemble a massive quantity of military equipment on this order unless you plan to deploy it. The problem is maintenance. You need to lube those vehicles. You need to give them oil changes. That requires getting them up on racks in garages. And when they're massively assembled out in the desert, and in these cases, there are no garages, there are no racks. It's clear it's for immediate deployment. We have documents coming down from U.S. Army headquarters about taking control of the human domain, about the combination of PSYOPs and special forces. There are combat troops from Iraq and Afghanistan involved in this. We have Green Berets, we have Marines, we have representatives of all 4 of the branches. The Pentagon recently conducted a study, believe it or not, in 2012 as to what percentage of the different military forces could be counted on to fire upon the American people. And it turned out some 70% of the National Guard would not fire on the American people. 90% of the Marines would not fire on the American people. 75% of the Air Force would fire on the American people. Very troubling, Greg. All by itself, the Pentagon should be conducting any such study.
Right.
Just as it's very troubling that we have over 300 FEMA camps. Very troubling that we have a North American command. Very troubling that the Department of Homeland Security has acquired over 2 billion rounds of 40 caliber hollow point ammunition, not even permissible in combat under the Hague Convention of 1899, because this is ammunition that's designed to tear apart bodies and kill people. Standard military ammunition is pointed and copper jacketed, designed to pass through a body, to take a soldier out of combat, not to rip his body apart. And when you combine the massiveness of this event, which is supposed to begin on 15 July and end on 15 September, you have to ask yourself what's going on. I have observed more than once that an operation that extends for over 2 months is not a drill. That's an occupation.
Yeah, and you had mentioned Walmart, and I'm really intrigued by this piece of the puzzle because I have had some researchers come on the show and say that other researchers are trying to connect unrelated things and that the Walmart closures are more about manufacturing an excuse for Wall Street when they see just how bad retail numbers really are, so they can push it off and say that, oh, well, we were doing all this maintenance on stores and distract from the fact that the economy is really crashing. But you're saying you've talked to people and gotten reports of some of the details on what they're really doing in these Walmart facilities. It shows that it's not just plumbing maintenance.
Oh, yeah. That was just a story. That was just a cover story. At none of these Walmarts has any effort been made to get plumbing permits. I mean, it was ridiculous on its face. They closed them abruptly. It turns out there are long-standing agreements between FEMA and Walmart that anytime FEMA needs them, Walmarts will close and turn themselves over to FEMA. They're being reconfigured to be sources of logistics supply for the operations in the field. I mean, what could be more obvious? A Walmart is a place you go to get supplies, normally in the past civilian. Now in this new guy's military. You need a tank? Call Walmart. You need a helicopter? Call Walmart. They're bringing tons and tons and tons of military equipment, ammunition, weapons, and so forth to these Walmarts. They are taking these massive steel shipping containers you'd normally find on a freighter at sea, which are loaded with all kinds of equipment, including, I surmise, bars to construct prisons inside the Walmarts. And they're using the containers themselves to block off access to the rear of the Walmarts and create what appear to be exercise areas for the detainees where they can't possibly escape unless they could scale those massive steel barriers. And of course, that's not about to happen. So we have the Walmart serving multiple functions: command and control, logistics supply, and detainee processing, where they'll figure out which FEMA camp to send you to. I have no doubt they're going to split up families and children one place, parents, husbands one place, wives another. I mean, it's all completely awful and very much on the order of what we have been told about the operation of these German work camps. And they're going to put the Americans who are incarcerated to work. We have these private prisons in the South that have been hiring new personnel in anticipation of a rapid expansion. It cannot be a coincidence that this is taking place at the same time that Jade Helm is gearing up to go full throttle, where I must say I admire the governor of Texas, whose name is Abbott, who has directed the Texas State Guard to monitor Jade Helm. A new survey in Texas shows that 55% of Texans are wary of these military operations within their state, as well they should be. It augurs no good for the American people. And as I may have already observed, I regard this as the greatest threat to freedom and democracy in the United States that our nation has ever confronted in its history.
Yeah, it's definitely a scary thing. I have such a hard time kind of finding where the line is between some people's paranoia, I guess, spouting off all kinds of things online. You know, of course that happens. And then getting the real truth here. It definitely seems concerning and scary. I'm curious why Walmart would do this, because it's kind of PR suicide for the brand. They could never really exist again after doing something like this.
Well, it turns out Walmart's received billions and billions of dollars in subsidy for the government, that these arrangements with FEMA appear to have been in place from the beginning. In other words, these Walmarts appear to have been designed to be dual-purpose facilities: civilian in normal times, military in times of need, determined strictly by FEMA. And as I may or may not have already mentioned, Sam Walton was an Army intelligence officer in World War II and ran detention camp facilities. So he was a perfect guy to understand what might be needed if these Walmarts were to be converted in the future for precisely that function.
And I've heard that Utah and Texas, you know, of course they're big in this operation. I've heard they're being targeted because they're trying to start issuing currency in gold and silver through some back channel legislation. Have you heard anything about that?
Well, that's extremely interesting. I know that Texas has asked for the return of $1 billion in gold. I guarantee you they won't get it. Germany wanted to have the return of some $7 billion in gold. Germany didn't get it. I wouldn't be surprised if the vaults at Fort Knox are actually completely empty and bereft of any gold whatsoever. But the fact of the matter is we have this very elaborate military operation taking place. It's in violation of posse comitatus, a statute from 1878 that precludes the use of military force to perform police function. They're trying to get around it by asking permission for various communities and landowners for the right to use their property. None of those permissions ought to be granted. All of them ought to be rescinded. And of course, this is obvious a blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment, given that we have learned from some who have been trained in Jade Helm that their objective in going home to home is going to be to confiscate guns and excess food. In other words, someone is going to be designated a food hoarder if they have more than 1 week's worth of supplies on hand. Now, Greg, why should anyone have any restriction on how much food they want to hoard? It can only be because Henry Kissinger's position is being implemented, to wit, they want to manipulate the American people by putting them in a state of starvation where they don't have access to food, so that can be used as a leverage to get them to voluntarily enter these FEMA camps. If you're facing starvation or entering a FEMA camp, many Americans would prefer to enter a FEMA camp, even if that means consigning their lives thereafter to a state of slavery. I myself am unwilling to adopt that approach. I am a stand your ground kind of guy, and I am going to resist any effort made to deprive me of my right to keep and bear arms. And the whole scenario is a travesty. It's draconian, it's Orwellian, and they're using a whole series of these incidents that are fabricated. I'm talking about Sandy Hook. I'm talking about the Boston bombing. I'm talking about Ferguson, Missouri. I'm talking about the Walter Scott shooting. I'm even talking about Charleston, about which I've just done a lengthy program last night, revealing that these are all contrived one way or another. These are all staged or fabricated events. Take, for example, Charleston, which is foremost on everyone's mind given its currency that it has just happened. There's a famous photograph of this young man entering the back of the church, but it turns out he's actually wearing a $1,000 bulletproof vest, which the government hasn't acknowledged, and the date and the time on the image are wrong. They're not for the date and the time. In fact, the time is like 8:30 in the morning, whereas this event, the shooting, took place in the evening. I think they had someone involved in processing this who didn't understand a 24-hour clock. And they thought if it said, the time read to them as though it was 8:17, they thought that meant PM, when of course 0800 is AM. That to be PM, it would have to be 2000, not 0800. So, I think there were glitches here. The people we're dealing with are not all rocket scientists. And, even Dick Gregory gave a 1-hour interview about Charleston where he was reflecting that he was very troubled that they didn't have a series of ambulances there immediately to take the bodies or the dead or wounded off to hospitals where they could be declared dead or alive. This is just what happened at Sandy Hook. They didn't have a surge of EMTs into the building. They didn't have a series of ambulances. Officially, the bodies were all left in a heap in the classroom until they were removed in the dead of night. That's completely absurd. We'd all been troubled by indication that something was wrong at Sandy Hook. There was a sign, for example, that said everyone must check in. That seemed very odd. We have video from inside the firehouse showing stacks of pizza cartons and bottled water. That seemed very odd. There were porta potties there. People had their name tags on color-coded, on lanyards that were color-coded. We had parents bringing children to the event. This has all been most puzzling. Wolfgang Halbig, who's a former Florida state trooper and a former school principal and a nationally recognized school safety expert, simply sought to find information about what had happened to Sandy Hook so he could share it with other school districts when he conducted symposia on school safety. And he found that none of his FOIA requests were being answered, none of his phone calls were being returned, and the next thing he knew, 2 detectives from the homicide branch of the local police were on his doorstep in his gated community telling him that if he continued to raise questions about Sandy Hook, the Connecticut State Police were going to prosecute him. Well, that was the wrong thing to say to Wolfgang. He's pursued the matter to the extent that we're now making significant legal breakthroughs about which I will describe momentarily. We have, in the meanwhile, discovered the manual, the FEMA manual for Sandy Hook, where it explains right in the manual there's going to be a rehearsal on the 13th. It says right in the manual, everyone must check in. It says right in the manual, refreshments and restrooms will be provided. They won't let information about the porta potties, as innocuous as that sound, reach Wolfgang, because it would reveal they were delivered on the 13th when the shooting officially took place on the 14th. This is a huge, elaborate scam. It explains why parents would be bringing children to the scene of a child shooting massacre. There was no massacre. No children died. It was an elaborate hoax, as indeed was the Boston bombing.
Man, yeah, that's super fascinating. And in terms of this most recent shooting, that's kind of what I'm curious. Well, they also found out, I've read that there was a military operation, a drill conducted at the same time, which is one of the go-to pieces of evidence we find, whether it's 9/11 or the Boston bombing or Sandy Hook or now Charleston. There always seems to be a military exercise going on at the same time, and I think that creates a lot of confusion. It also seems like what might be happening is just these military drills with crisis actors end up going live, and they might not even know it.
Greg, you're absolutely right. I mean, what sense would it make to have an active shooter drill going on in Charleston, South Carolina, and a prominent political figure like Hillary Clinton being there at the same time? What's the probability she would be campaigning with a minister who would be shot that evening during the day before the shooting? And because she was coincidentally there, she was able to send her personal photographer into the church to take photographs that no doubt are going to show up in subsequent campaign commercials. You got to be kidding me.